Thank you very much, Chunka. Excellent, excellent walkthrough of this idea. Want to just quickly remind folks that we're taking email questions as ever, and so anytime we can get those delivered to us. I'm going to kind of throw a couple of things that come up that occur to me, and one is specific to the IR officer's role, in the sense that you had two kind of quintessential examples, Conseco and Quaker Oats. In Conseco's case, the CEO said the market got it wrong initially, and in fact the market had prior to that, in his mind, gotten it wrong by punishing Green Tree's stock. In the case of Quaker Oats, it bought Snapple, which was one of the hottest IPOs of its time period. In other words, the street endorsed Snapple as this brand that was very valuable. So I think that the vexing issue for an IR officer is to try and reflect what the street's view or the questions they'll have, and yet try and while also figuring out whether the street has it right or wrong. I mean, obviously not an easy calculation, but how do you think that has to be navigated?
Well, it's actually, in this case, in the Quaker Oats Snapple case, the street was supportive of the concept and almost revolted at the price. So most everyone thought they overpaid. But I think that your general point is right. You can't rely on, you can't assume that the street is always right. I think you have to anticipate their questions, and you have to be able to answer those questions, and in case they might be right, or at least have a credible answer. But it's just one of many perspectives you need to bring to it. And I think ultimately you do need to go back to first principles and ask fundamental questions about the deal. And walk through those red flags that we talked about.
Sure. Yeah, it strikes me that, at least in many organizations, the way that an IR officer becomes more valued and essentially advances within the company is, in part anyway, and I'm not saying this is with every company, is to be that deliverer of the message that the street misunderstands us to some degree. And so we have to try to educate them or characterize ourselves in a way that's more advantageous to us. So I wonder if that would create this inherent tendency to say, no, boss, you're right. We'll just have to deliver that message to the street.
Well, I recognize it's a sensitive situation that you're in. I think that your power comes from the standpoint that you inevitably have to have an outside-in perspective. You have to be able to address those external questions. And in the course of doing that, you have to understand the situation from the mindset of the external constituents. At the same time, you have to understand the internal constituents as well and why they're driving. I mean, this is not an argument. Well, the reason we talk about Kodak is that this is not an argument for not taking risks or not doing anything. It's an argument for really deep deliberation. And recognizing that oftentimes that doesn't happen. So, you know, I think we've all been in situations where something just seems so right that the best thing to do is to charge forward as quickly as possible. And what I'm saying is that it's never right to charge forward as quickly as possible.
Right. You know, from a real high altitude look, you know, an economic theorist would say, this is capitalism, right? I mean, risks leading to failures or trying to forestall, you know, risk-taking leading to failures is how the system itself goes forward, right? Creative destruction, everything else. One of the things that I found as a maybe unintended theme of the book, in each of the categories of the common, you know, categories of failure, a lot of the takeaway for me was you have to know what kind of company you are. You have to know your limitations, your capacities, what you're actually good at, what you're bad at, and what your ultimate potential is. In other words, you know, everybody here probably wants to say that they're a 10% grower. Nominal GDP doesn't grow anywhere near 10%. You can't all be right. So how do you, you know, is that in fact the proper conclusion?
Well, one comment on something you said earlier. Somebody's always going to lose, but it doesn't have to be you, right? So you don't want. There are steps you can take to let the other people make the mistakes and not make them yourself. And you're right. I mean, part of this comes down to, do you really understand and know your organization? But it's not enough, right? Because that itself is intuition born from experience. And one of the things we're really trying to argue is that intuition is never enough, right? That your experience, the problem with intuition is that you don't know when it doesn't apply. Mm-hmm. You don't know when it's going to drop off the cliff. So you have to have a safety net for when your intuition fails.
Mm-hmm. And obviously that has to be something other than, well, we're going to commission kind of a strategy reporter, bring in a consultant who's going to put on paper what our intuition is. Right?
Yeah, well, I think it's good to get an outside perspective. Yeah. The thing you have to be concerned about is that many times the people with the outside perspective have their own agenda that will color their perspective. And I'm not saying that they will disregard the facts, but if you're the banker who's going to do the transaction, you have an agenda. If you're a consultant who's going to do the follow-on work, the merger integration work, you have an agenda. So, as much as possible, if you anticipate the problems, you're going to prescribe solutions, mm-hmm. and almost nobody will say, you know what, in the end, we don't think you should do that.
Right. I was wondering if you found in your research whether there were companies that perhaps did a little bit better, or just in general, by having some kind of objective standards for, here's the kind of hurdle rates we have, here's the kind of investments we make, we require a certain return on capital. Obviously, these can be manipulated as well, yeah. But for folks who adhere to some kind of measurable discipline, is there anything that distinguishes those types of companies?
Discipline is good. You have to be careful when discipline gets twisted to other agendas. I mean, we all know that we can tweak spreadsheets to get to any number we want, and we can bury those tweaks so far into the model that nobody will ever find them if we want to, and we can do that in good conscience because it's hard to understand the ripple effects of all these different things. So discipline is good. There's an element of discipline that everybody has hurdle rates and returns and things. One of the things that often doesn't exist is a safety margin, mm-hmm. a wide safety margin, and an honest, explicit declaration of safety margin and what the assumptions are around it. I think that helps as well. The problem is all these techniques help you incrementally, and almost all these large failures that we see are when the steps aren't incremental, but they're large steps.
Yeah. It's interesting you talk about the spreadsheet. I think I wrote something years ago about how there's one sort of theory that the advent of the Excel spreadsheet essentially created the private equity industry as we know it, and also kind of created the sort of sell-side research, let's beat the numbers kind of thing as we know it, because you can reverse engineer the model, right? You can start with your answer and then change every line on up the chain.
If I could, there's an interesting technique that we described in the book called discovery-driven planning. And what it does is it basically says, give me the numbers, but I assume that you can tweak the model to get the right numbers. So just start from the right numbers. But what I want to see are the assumptions mm-hmm. explicitly of what has to happen in order for those numbers to be achieved.